the chat is still disabled.
It is. And you know what? I've been having problems with Zoom all morning and it won't log in. So I sent you a copy of the error messages that I'm getting. I still can't log into Zoom. I've just subverted how I use Zoom to be able to run the class. So we'll work on that. I really want you to be able to chat with each other because part of the thing is this group work too, right? I mean, other than just, so I recognize that. So we have a little break in about 90 minutes from now. There's a 15-minute break and then there's the lunch break. So between the two breaks, if I can have that resolved, that will be wonderful. So bear with me. This is obviously a problem not of my making, but we'll try to fix that. In the meantime, well, feel free to have the communication through Zoom. I mean, verbally, just because you are unable to chat, or send me a message so I can read it out to the, I mean, however you wish to do that. I'm sorry, it's not straightforward, but I'm going to blame Zoom. Okay, as students are rolling back in, I'm just making sure everybody gets a chance to come in, and then we'll start talking. We have 16. We are at 9:10. I'll admit students as they come in, but we'll get started just to stay on track. Couple of things. I think everybody has had a chance possibly to go on D2L and check the course outline out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen so we can talk a little bit about the course outline itself. So let's go share my screen. There might be a little bit of a delay in viewing screens. It is over the internet, so that's just how it is. Okay, let's see, we go to D2L, let's go to content. Let's start with some Zoom protocols. All of us are in different locations with different internet speeds. So while I have the video on for now, I will be turning off the video as we go through the presentations. All of you, right now, since you are unable to chat with each other, anytime you want to speak, just go ahead. There's a raise hand icon. You can go ahead and raise your hand, just so we're not talking over each other. And then you can, once I give you the okay, go ahead and unmute yourself, say your comment, whatever it is that you wish to state or to address regarding the course, or whatever you wish to address regarding a peer's comment, or whatever that is. Once we get the chat feature sorted out, it should work out much better. But for the moment, we have what we have. The other thing is, we said to stay on mute. Videos are not, you don't have to get your video up and running. In fact, I would recommend that you don't, because if someone has 25 or 26 videos streaming in on their computer and their connection is a little up and down, it might affect their ability to receive instruction or receive the lecture in a proper manner. So that's great. I notice most of you have your videos on, videos off, and that's good. What else? Well, that's pretty much it for Zoom protocols. Now, I recognize that this is a compact course and we are all going to be sitting in front of a screen for a large part of our day. So I've broken it up. So we will just go over the course outline a little so you'll understand, in case you haven't had a chance to see it. Well, most of you probably have. So that's the content. It's based off of your textbook. We will go chapter by chapter. Now, one of the things you have to understand is that this course is not heavy on theory. Well, it talks about theories, but it doesn't address, dissect, or discuss theories in very much detail, but it's introducing a new concept. It's introducing masculinities. So there's a lot of material to read and a lot to understand. And rather than me teach concepts, outside of the book, which you would have to go back and read the book and then relate the concepts and contextualize the theories and concepts, I will go with the book, pretty much with the book, because it's all new content. So it's going to be more of a narrative type of course. We'll talk about the content in each of the chapters instead of dissecting and analyzing in detail. And I think that's appropriate because masculinities are not studied all that well. There are, I would say, no men's studies courses in Canada, as far as I know. So it's very, even in North America, it's poorly understood. Your textbook itself is limited because your textbook addresses masculinities from a very North American white heterosexual point of view. So it's limited in that sense. There's no global perspective, but it is a good book. And it is what we have for now. So we will learn about what we have. And at some point, if you're more interested, that could be part of your research project, your thesis project, or graduate school, or whatever it is. Now, when we look at the schedule, introduction itself isn't it's an introduction. We talk about the course outline, of course, but we will be talking about the course and the contents of the course as well. So as you notice, the first 90 minutes is me speaking and us interacting and you asking questions or having comments. Then between 10:30 and 10:45, there's a 15-minute health break. We all can't stay seated all the time. It's not a good thing. So get up, stretch, walk around, visit the bathroom, drink some water, speak to God, whatever works for you. Okay. Again, we have about an hour and a half of the second lecture before we adjourn for lunch. Lunch is between 12:15 and 1:30. It's a 1 hour and 15-minute lunch. I have portioned lunch quite generously, and I did intend the pun. But we may have to squeeze it by 10 or 15 minutes. We may or may not, depending on what speed the lectures go at. I haven't timed my lectures. I haven't had an opportunity to do that. I am going to try to stick to my times, but lectures, I'll try not to run into any of the break times, any of the health break times, but lectures might run overlap in times. For example, masculinities may run a little longer. It may go into the space I've allocated for negotiating age relations and aging and so on. So we have students still coming in. On days 2, 3, and 4, you will be watching a film. The film is in context of what we're learning. And even though I've signified a lecture portion at the end of the film, the lecture portion itself will be very short. We'll try to contextualize what we see in the film with the theories that we've learned in the course. I think that would be the best way to do it. And the last day, day 5, is I will take a break from speaking. I will obviously comment and add questions, but it is student presentations, and student presentations are as a group. Okay, so student presentations are as a group. You are 24 students, I believe, and so you've been split up into groups of 6. Marking is going to be very straightforward for the presentations itself. You have 2 other assignments. We'll talk about them as well, but since we are talking about presentations on day 5, we'll start there. The presentation is worth 20% of your final mark. For the presentation itself, you do not have to turn your video on. That's fine, but you will have to share your screen, share your presentation with the class. And it's 20%, and we're only talking about organization. It's going to be a very short presentation, between 5 and 7 minutes. So maybe 1 or 2 slides.
I don't have any new document.
Sorry, somebody's speaking in the background. Could you say that again, please?
I'm on maternity leave, I told you last time.
Sorry, I can barely hear you. Hello?
It was the EI payment, like from the bank account.
Sorry, if this is a private conversation and I really don't want to hear it. I can't identify who it is. Can you please mute yourself?
Yeah.
Hello?
So,
Okay. All right. I think we figured it out. All right, excellent. Okay, so it's a 5 to 7 minute presentation, 1 or 2 slides at most. You will divvy up each of the remainder of the chapters in your textbook within your group and make the presentation. Now, obviously, the way the chapter is split up, each section that you have will not have its own summary. So you are going to have to go ahead and create that. You're going to have to talk about the themes of what you read and make the connection. And while organizing as a group, try to keep it so that it has a logical flow and all of those things. So it actually sounds like a good presentation. So does anyone have questions about the presentations, about the group presentations? Your chat is not working unless you want to directly chat with me, but feel free to speak up in class if you'd like.
So are we
Hi
doing
there. Oh, go ahead. You go, Nick.
So are we, is our group, is like a group tackling like one chapter?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, I just have a quick question regarding the group project. So you mentioned having to share our screen for the presentation. Is it just going to be sharing one screen for the participants in the presentation? Or are each of us supposed to do like our own presentation and then share that screen like individually?
I would prefer the individual sharing, and I'll tell you why. I know it's convenient for one person to put it up and share the screen, but it's also getting familiar with the technology. You guys are going to be using this technology probably at least for the next 3-4 months, if not for the whole year. Some of you are quite experienced in sharing your screen, sharing your presentation, and some of you aren't. I think it's a good idea for all of you to practice sharing your screen being a presenter. So there's an added skill that some of you will gain out of this exercise.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
No problem.
Hi, I also had a question. You mentioned something about like breakout rooms to like
discuss?
For the class. Like how would that work?
Well, you guys are already assigned in groups. I would go ahead and create the 4 breakout rooms during the breaks. This is my thinking right now. During class, there's no need for you to be in breakout rooms because you should really be attending to the lecture. So there's no need at that point. We can create the breakout rooms, and you can give me your opinion. I'm open to ideas. We will go with one idea. We can't satisfy everybody, and you have to recognize that. We can create the big breakout rooms during the 15-minute break, which I don't think is fair because I really want you to get off your seats, go walk, go to the washroom, do whatever it is you need to. I don't want you to actually get busy then. But your lunch break, which is 1 hour and 15 minutes, if you folks are up for it, we'll set the breakout rooms by your group at that point.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
And we can also do the breakout rooms after class. Now, class technically ends at 3:50 or something. You can look at your web advisor and it gives you a certain time. But I can have the breakout rooms open till about 8 p.m. at night.
All right.
Okay, so after class, you guys can connect with each other in your breakout rooms and discuss how you want to plan your presentations and so on.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Okay, all right. Well, I will continue on with the course outline itself. I know you all have taken a look, but I just thought we'd go through it. Unless you folks feel that you're comfortable and let's get started, then we can do that. So feel free to interrupt. I'm quite thick-skinned and I don't offend easily, so don't worry about that, okay? You have 3 assignments. One assignment is your presentation. We just spoke about it. And then you have a class participation, and I'm going to tell you how it all works out. Now, for the presentation, one of the things we didn't speak about is how your groups are split up. Now, on your D2L, you have this list, color-coded list as to how I've split the groups up. Okay, so I believe there are 4 groups of 6 people each. Find your respective partner. You can initiate communication on email during the day if the breakout rooms aren't already set up for the evening. Now, because the presentation is on the last day, you have the option of the breakout room to use when you watch the film, but I'd prefer you watch the film at that time because the memory will be fresh. So I'm actually thinking perhaps I won't keep them on at that time. So never mind, forget that. We'll leave the breakout rooms open in the evening till 8, 9, 10 p.m., whatever it is, however long you want it, and you folks can communicate with each other, and that might be the way to do it. Okay. What else? Oh, the films themselves, I already mentioned. You can rent them from any source you like. They are available on YouTube as well. I don't know if they're all available on Netflix, if they're available on Amazon Prime or any other feature, but try to watch the film during the allocated time. That way you are ready for a discussion after. There is a 20% component to class participation, and I'll tell you how that works. Okay, so assignment 1 is you're going to answer the question. You're going to talk about any 2 models of masculinities, and then you're going to describe the 2 models in your own words. You're going to identify similarities and differences, and then shortcomings in each paradigm. Now, you will have, we would have discussed chapter 2 already in class. You can still go back to your textbook, reinforce the concepts one more time, and go ahead and write this out. Now, the word limit for this, and I should probably specify that. The word limit for this assignment, I don't want it more than, well, 500 words, between 500 and 750 words, no more than that. I don't need references, but go ahead, have kind of an introductory section. Go ahead and have a body and then a little bit of a conclusion. They're not going to be elaborate, and the idea is to not tax you after your rather long day. It's going to be long. We already know that coming in, and you will still have a little bit of work in the evening, so you keep it short. The third assignment, these are all based on questions and concepts that we will be exploring, and all of these assignments have timelines. The last assignment is due August 29th, so day after. So you will be busy that Saturday finishing up this assignment. Now, none of these responses need to be very, very lengthy. Maximum of 500 words for each of these questions, so it can be as short as 250, but at least show me that you understand what these concepts are all about. Okay. Class participation. Now, first of all, sorry, go ahead.
The assignments. Are you wanting it in like paragraph form, written out in like, I know you said you don't want a lot of detail, like it doesn't need to be elaborate, or do you want like answered like question 1 and then like written, and then question 2 and then written, or do you want like paragraph form like that?
No, just respond to each of the questions. So for these, this is not, so assignment 1 is a little bit more of an essay style. So you're going to have an introductory paragraph, you're going to have a body, and you're going to have a conclusion. Now, these are short answer questions. The best way to think about these is short answer questions. So you go ahead and explain the concept and pretty much respond to the questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. Okay. Brian, please go ahead.
So for assignment 3, we don't have to, so you said it's 500 words per question, right? Or is it 500 words for the whole thing?
500 words per question is the maximum. If you feel very, very, if you really want to express yourself, go with 500 words.
Okay. Yeah,
okay. This is the way I think about it. If you are very expressive and you're accurate and you're on point, you may be able to get away with 100 words. I don't know what that number is. I give room. Some people take a little more time to get to the point. Some people get to the point right away. And some people are in between, right? So that's why I, threw a big range there. Okay. All right. So yeah, you'll find as you're answering these questions, you might find that some questions you can easily answer in a couple hundred words, and some questions you might find that you're going to need the 500 words to answer. So you'll as you move forward, you'll understand how that works. Class participation, 20%. This is an interesting concept because, as I told you, this is most of my courses for students. A lot of you students have attended my courses before. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of asking questions, responding to questions, and back and forth communication between me and students. This course is not designed that way in the sense that I'm not going to be quizzing you on a lot of content simply because these are all new concepts, and while we can discuss them, it's a little bit trickier. So you may have questions and comments, but you're really going to have to plan them out, but you should ask them. So as I have this checklist, I have a sheet exactly like this printed in front of me. So when you ask a question, a comment, or pose a comment, or pose an observation, whatever it is relevant to what we're learning, I'm going to put a check mark next to your name. Okay. The more check marks you have, the more marks you get for class participation. Okay. Obviously, things that are not relevant, like how long is lunch break, great question, but not directly relevant. So we're probably not going to give you a check mark for that. So, you know, it's a pretty simple system. That's how it works. I don't believe in taking attendance because you know, you'll pay attention and attend if this course is useful to you. So I'm not concerned that you will or will not attend. That is not something I'm going to worry about. Academic integrity, these are general stuff. You can go ahead and read it. I'm not going to worry about it. And there's a section about appealing your grade, you know, all of these official things that I have to communicate with you. So that's all. I'll let you go ahead and read that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. We don't need to see this anymore. But I think I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to do a little switcheroo. So you see me on this laptop. I'm going to turn my video off, and I'm going to do my presentation from a different computer. You'll be able to see that in a second. It's just for convenience. So if you see me disappear, I will show up momentarily. So hang in there. Okay, I guess we should be okay now. Don't worry, I'm still here. I just turned my video off so that I'm not sharing too many things and overwhelming the system. Okay. So lecture one, the first lecture, which we will pause at 10:30 for a little break, it's introducing the idea of men and aging. If anybody can't hear me, let me know. The chat window will allow communication as well, but I may not pay attention to the chat window once I start speaking. It's not that I like the sound of my own voice so much, but it's just hard to pay attention to the chat window. So just speak up. And if you can't hear me, just let me know one way or the other. Okay. All right. So men and masculinities. What is interesting is there's a plurality of both words. The way this course is men and aging, right? So there's a plurality. Both words imply a couple of things, even though they're not stated. Just by saying men, we are implying diversity, okay? A sense of many. And same thing with masculinities. And what we're implying is there are many masculinities, just as there are many men. And without saying, we're implying that there is a difference between each of those various components. As gerontology students, you're already aware of the fact that older adults are not a homogeneous population. They're all individuals, and any appreciation, any understanding of older adults is done through an individual sense of recognizing them. It's the same thing with the old men. It's no different. The ideas of what masculinity or what represents masculinity is always framed, it's contextualized within culture, within age cohorts, within generations, within social class, and what it means to be a man, okay? Whether you're a blue-collar worker, your sexuality, religious faith, your ethnicity, your generation, your social class, they all define what masculinity is all about. It's almost a deception to assume there is a model. There are significant differences in how men practice masculinities within all of these different contexts that we spoke about. So the idea of a model simply doesn't exist. There is no one masculinity. There's no one way to be a man, or there's no one maleness. And this is something we learned throughout this course. The majority of discussions on masculinity, what they look at is they locate old men, or they look at old men as being quote unquote diminished. Basically, the problem with this kind of theorizing is that, well, there's one kind of masculinity that obviously increases, builds up into adulthood, and then once you get old, it starts to go away, right? Can you think of the problems associated with this kind of theorizing? What's the issue here? So the way a lot of masculinity is defined in culture and society is, well, as you're a child, but as you start to get into adolescence and you start to become a man, when I say you, I'm not referring to the class, I'm referring to males. You become a man, and as you start to get older, you're no longer, well, your masculinity disappears, right? So what's the problem with this idea? What do you think is the problem with this idea? Go ahead, Akifa.
It's sort of like showing, like, what is it to be masculine? Like, your masculinity disappears. What does that even mean? There's no like one way of being masculine. Like, how do you define what is being masculine? What is being feminine?
Exactly. I know 2 more students have their hands up. 3 participants raised their hand. I don't know who was first, but go ahead. One of you can take a start.
I'm not sure if I was first or not, but basically, as a man gets older, like once he becomes an older adult, obviously he needs more help, and he may need the help of even a care provider. But because of masculinity, he might feel a little bit embarrassed to ask for the help. So sometimes older adults try and push themselves to do things on their own, even though they're not like no longer capable, just because they're too embarrassed to actually reach out and ask for the help because they want to be able to do it on their own.
Right, and that's another concept that we will visit. So thank you for that. I think that's a good response. Same for you, Kifa. I think I have Brian, and I have who else? I think that's pretty much it. Go ahead, Brian.
So it's kind of like putting an expiry date on masculinity. Like, hey, once you're old, you no longer can be masculine because of your age. It's kind of like restricting you to a certain period. And
Yep.
Kind of like conflicting all the men, because the reason why men are kind of like, I'd say, you know, they're always a little bit more aggressive and trying to be like masculine is because they know that the youth is the most important part of being masculine. And once you're old, it almost ties in with your personal well-being and your mental well-being because of the time constraint.
Beautiful answer, Brian. I love it. Fantastic. We're going to talk about some of the concepts that you've actually spoken here, because these are, well, we'll get to this. Good comment. We'll get to this comment in subsequent lectures as well. Yeah, no, spot on. I don't see any more hands, so that's good. I will carry on. Did I miss anybody? Did somebody raise their hand and I didn't pay attention?
I had my hand up.
Sorry, Keela. We missed you clearly.
It's okay.
Go ahead, please.
So I was thinking that if the idea of masculinity is the same for everyone, then it can create stereotypes.
And that, yeah, absolutely.
It can restrict it can restrict how society views older men.
Yes, all true, 100%. Okay, so the issue, as you can imagine, I'm just gonna go ahead and fix a little thingamdo on my screen. Oh, sorry, I didn't do what I was supposed to do. There we go. So yes, so the issue obviously is, as Brian said, some of the other students, Akila, Akifa, and I can't remember, I have the names, I have the check mark. I'm not going to go down the list and look at that. But the idea is that one of the concepts that you will be introduced to moving forward is the idea of a Peter Pan masculinity, or a never-ending masculinity. Instead of recognizing that what old men practice is masculinity as well, culturally masculinity seems to have an expiry date. So you don't meet the expiry date, you're no longer, well, you got to be pretending that you are pre-expiry date so that you're still considered a man. So implied in this idea is that old men's practices do not represent masculinity. And the goal of this course, obviously, is to contest that idea, okay? Is to basically speak to the fact that masculinity is fluid. It changes dynamically throughout the life cycle. And you cannot measure masculinity at one age against another. That makes no sense. We will also speak to the idea that masculinity is extremely diverse. It is, like we said, it falls in the context of culture, age cohorts. So for example, how the baby boomers practice masculinity, or their masculinities, pardon me, because each male practices their masculinity differently. But even as a group, there are certain similarities. Those similarities itself will be quite diverse from men in their 40s and 50s now practicing their masculinity, or their masculinities. So we're going to look at all of these points in more detail. As I mentioned, the book is somewhat limited because it looks at a very white North American masculinity from a very heteronormative point of view, which means it talks mostly about masculinities from a heterosexual male's point of view. So in that sense, it is limited, but it gives us a good starting point. And those of you who have taken any women's studies courses know that the beginnings of feminism were also, it was limited. The initial studies were looking at basically white women and in the context of suffrage rights and so on. And then it started to grow, and then it's a massive, massive field right now. Masculinity they started studying masculinities as something important to study and something that had enough diversity to study much later. So a lot of the roots of masculinity studies are based in feminist studies. They took a lot of those ideas in how feminism was analyzed, how it was broken down, how the theories were created, and they were able to use them. And I think that was brilliant. Rather than go ahead and reinvent the wheel, start using a field that is really, really well developed. So again, not to reiterate, we're going to look at old men's lives and the aging masculinities that old men practice. So what do we know about masculinities? So there is an important role for critical theory. Those of you who have taken some sociology courses, I know we have a diverse class here, so some of you have taken a lot of sociology, some of you have taken a lot of gerontology, some of you have taken a mix, some of you are straight science students, so it's a mix. So I'm just going to break it down. If you already know this concept, that's fine. If you don't know the concept, then well, welcome to it. So according to theorists of European Marxist tradition, there's no singular critical theory. Critical theory is the idea that there's a theory that is different from a traditional theory. A traditional theory, what it does is it looks at a bunch of different evidence and it tries to connect the evidences together to explain an idea. Okay, that's a traditional theory. A critical theory is different because it is critical to the extent that it looks to free humans from the traditional explanation of things. Maybe it's emancipation from slavery. It acts as a liberating influence. It frees you from existing explanations. That's what a critical theory is supposed to do. So there's no singular critical theory. There are several critical theories. And the idea of a critical theory is it tries to, so for example, when we think about masculinities, traditional masculinities from a heteronormative point of view, everything that a man does is defined by what a heterosexual man does in his day-to-day life, from very limited, if you look at it in a very limited fashion. A critical theory would be looking at males as individuals and seeking to define individual masculinities, thereby freeing any attachment to the quote-unquote normative masculinity. So that's what a critical theory is supposed to do. And the idea is that these theories aim to explain and transform all circumstances that enslave human beings. And this is from your textbook. So critical theories have emerged in connection with many social movements, which have identified inequalities that arise because of existing social structures. And they look at the various dimensions of domination of human beings in modern societies. So even in a broad sense and a narrow sense, a critical theory, what it does is it describes and says what's normal for social inquiry. And it's aimed at making society more equitable and increasing freedom for all the people associated. So critical theory has had a very important role in understanding masculinities, because traditional masculinity is assumed as a singular form as to what all men must subscribe to. And that's where critical theory comes in. It questions that very notion and it breaks it down and forces the recognition of multiple masculinities. So all masculinities, when we practice, there are some men in this class. I'm a man myself. And the point is, all of our masculinities are different. The context of our masculinities is largely within practices that occur within the structures of our society, taking into account the social inequality in different stages that we all experience, and in the context of gender. They also occur within historical situations where we are situated historically, within our geographic and sociocultural contexts. Age relations are also important to understand masculinities. All masculinities are not equal. So that's one thing you have to remember, and we'll talk about the inequality moving forward. One man doesn't equal a second man, doesn't equal a third man. So all men don't benefit from the same privilege or don't suffer the same inequality. Age relations are a key basis of inequality, and many writers have called attention to the moral discourses that look at life. In Western society, youth is praised. I think Brian mentioned this in his comment. Youth is valued, it's praised, and there's a misery perspective on aging in later life. So for example, old people, well, going downhill, right? That's a view. And it's internalized. It's not even it's not the view necessarily presented only by younger people. This kind of a perspective is internalized by older adults as well, and you'll hear that in conversation. As a consequence, older people are stigmatized oftentimes by their own peers for being old, and it's internalized. They're marginalized, if not scorned. Aging men are routinely, they're all seen as quote unquote seniors. So they're all a bunch of people who all have gray hair and who are all genderless. They're pretty much degendered or genderless. And that seems to be the social view. They drift and exist in the periphery of people's lives. Well, and this is the, I'm speaking to the content in your book itself. So when you think about it, mostly, if you look at media representations, if you look at what comes out in the news, there is some commentary on older adults and seniors, but for the most part, everything is centered around education, employment, children, and family responsibility. Let's take this COVID issue into context. Early in April and May, I believe, when there were infections in long-term care homes and some older adults lost their lives, unfortunately, or got admitted to the hospital, there was some focus on older adults. And that was critical, and it was appropriate that there was some focus to the challenges associated with caring for older adults and safety in long-term care homes. But that is rare. For the most part, almost everything revolves around education, employment, children, and family responsibility. Most of the news items on news channels, on the internet, revolve around these. So it's because, well, what do you talk about older men or older adults? They're just old people, seniors. I mean, so there's not much attention. And there's a representation of all old people being pretty much homogenous. Aging men are not the same. That's the whole point of this course. They are neither degendered or ungendered. They're simply men who are practicing their own masculinity. So each old man has his own identity. Each old man has gone through several transitions. Transitions are common throughout our life. Being an infant, being cared for at home, going to daycare, that's a transition. This transition from daycare to daycare and from daycare to school, from elementary to high school, from education, from completing your undergraduate degree to going to the workplace, or some of you are already working, so just transitioning to the workplace. From being single to being married, and then from being married or being in a relationship to being a parent. All of these are transitions. As older men, when you transition from pre-retirement to retirement and then the post-retirement, even in later life, there are a subset of these transitions. So these transitions are a little different when you think about it. You have grandfathering, you have retirement, you have health changes, sometimes health challenges, sometimes becoming a caregiver, sometimes being divorced, sometimes being widowed. All of these are challenges that are present in later life as well. All these transitions obviously shape an older adult's identity. Now, if you bought into the idea that I said before, that masculinities are diverse, they're different, no two men will practice masculinity similarly and benefit from any patriarchal dividend. We'll talk about that context a little bit later. Then it's easy for you to understand that all of these transitions are very different from one man to the next. So each person's identity is framed and created differently. And men's identities are relational, which means they're framed in the context of each of their multiple relationships throughout their life course. We all will have several relationships through their life course. That means each time there's a different relationship, the relative IDs are changing. Some identities drift, some shift. A drift is a more gradual change of identity. A drifting identity would say if someone is going through progressive osteoporosis, and I'm taking a health perspective, then they might transition from being perhaps physically active to a more relaxed method of exercising themselves physically. So that would be a drift. A shift would be somebody who goes through a heart attack or a stroke, a much more severe event. They have to drastically change their dietary habits, their exercise habits, their food, what they drink, lose weight, whatever it is. Or being married and then being widowed, that's a shift. So a drift is more gradual. So identities go through many drifts and many shifts throughout their lives. So, and because men are different, the complexity will ensure that no two men will end up with very similar identities. We're going to look at a concept later. I believe it is in chapter or lecture 3. It's in chapter 3, I believe. The idea is called habitus. There's a very famous sociologist who studied men. His name is Bourdieu. And I don't know if I'm getting the French pronunciation correct. You folks can correct me later. My French is rudimentary at best. Anyway, it's a French last name, Bourdieu, and he studied masculinities a lot. And he presents the ideas of habitus. The masculinity practiced by men and witnessed by women is what is adopted as a habitus. Habitus is, the simplest way of thinking about habitus is a bunch of preferences, tastes, and habits that are practiced by men. So that's called as a habitus. So each man has his own habitus. It's basically the habitus is an intersection of their generation, their class, their ethnicity, and their geography. Now, one thing to always remember is part of your identity is culturally bound, and cultures tend to be geographically pinned. So it is within these cultures or subcultures that people's lives are uniquely shaped and constructed. So if you live in Nunavut or on an Arctic hamlet, the construction of your masculinity is going to be quite different. You, as a man, you have to go hunt, you have to go fish, you have to bring meat. If you're in a bustling megapolis in India, if you're a man, you have to go get a high-paying job in tech or in business or something of that sort and bring money home. Your ability to fish is irrelevant, or to hunt. And what it means to be a man means very different things. If you're in an ancient city in Eastern Europe or amongst nomadic tribes, being a man is probably similar to being a man, what's expected from a man in Nunavut or Arctic hamlet. And these are broad strokes. We're not talking about individual masculinities, but even from the group similarities in what's expected. Geography is often the stage for people's view of others and their own experience of class, gender relations, and what they feel in terms of age. Now, we're going to look at an example from your textbook that shows a linkage of Scottish men linking their masculinities to their geographic location. I'm just going to read this out. A number, I don't know how good it shows up on your screen. So if in case it doesn't, you can go back to your textbook. This is from the introductory chapter. A number of participants cited examples that exaggerated the quote, legendary unquote, toughness of Glaswegian masculinities. So this is some Glasgow. Some older participants alluded to violent masculine practices relating to male territory in Glasgow as exhibited through the quote, gang warfare, unquote, of the razor years, 1950s, where you couldn't go out in certain streets because you were afraid that other men would attack you. So so when you read this, what do you think about the perception of masculinity in this context? What is expected from you as a man in this context? Kendra, go ahead, please.
Hi, yes. So I'm understanding that from this context that it's describing men as like that strong, like violent type that potentially, like if you cross them, that they could harm you type thing.
Thank you, Kendra. Absolutely. It's a very macho representation, right, of being a man. So if you're a man, you could get hurt or you're expected to hurt. So it's the context. Okay, this kind of physically aggressive masculinity, or quote unquote tough, was connected to very industrialized city of Glasgow, where workers did physically demanding, tough labor. And you see this in Sudbury as well. So I know a lot of you are not from Sudbury, but there are some students from Sudbury as well. Hey, Nicholas, you have a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like the people are exaggerating legendary toughness. So I feel like in Glasgow and like the streets of Glasgow, they're kind of viewed as like legendarily tough, like I guess. So I think that's like a masculinity associated with that geography, like Glasgow being the geography.
There could be an exaggeration. Absolutely, there could be an exaggeration, and a lot of masculinity is mythified. So the sense of to be a man, you have to be so tough, and sometimes it's overdone. But the mindset here is if you're a man in Glasgow, then you're expected to be able to take a few blows, land a few blows, and basically be able to deal with physical violence. Okay, so that's the idea. So thank you for the comments, both of you. Now, Nora Vincent did a lot of work in 2006. We'll go through the names of several authors. I don't require you to remember the names. They are already there in your textbook. You can go back and look at them. But we will talk about them because they had a lot to play. And the other thing you'll notice is a lot of the work is within the last 40 years on masculinities. It's a newish field, really. So there is an increased interest in understanding masculinities within the, because we recognize masculinities are different. So what Nora Vincent did in 2006 is, she started looking at masculinities within the context of class, age, and gender relations. She had an 18-month immersion experience disguised as a man. That's one brave woman, because she didn't know the context she's going into, and that's why brave. So Nora Vincent spent 18 months disguised as a man, living, working, and infiltrating many male-only communities in the US. So she infiltrated a white working bowling league, a Roman Catholic monastery, and a neoliberal men's therapy group. So she observed it's always a good idea when you're not part of a certain system to actually be an inside observer, because then you notice things that as men you might not. So she sees many coded social relations. She speaks of many quote unquote unspoken male codes. For example, a handshake of passing respect or friendly greeting. Men shake hands as respect, or even just to say hello. Both are practices of inclusion. Interestingly, what she also observed is when there's a bad team player, say they're playing volleyball or bowling or whatever it is, a bad team player will often be encouraged and instructed. There's a lot of instruction, and I'll tell you, being a guy that plays tennis, when I'm playing badly, I get a lot of it. Anyway, will often be encouraged and instructed more than ridiculed. She also notices that masculinity practices are fluid and they're often remade. Because gender relations are so deeply rooted in everyday practices, because they're so quote unquote normal, they tend to be invisible and they're believed to be essential. Let's take the example of the handshake. Shaking someone's hand is very common in Western culture. Okay, I've been in the United States and in Canada for over 20 years. So for me, that's very normal. But if you go to an Eastern culture, you go to the Muslim world, or you go to India, the first thing people do is they will put their hands together in a namaste, if you're going to India, to greet you. And that's a sign of respect, not necessarily shaking your hand. If you go to an Islamic country, depending on where you go, they will greet you with a salam alaikum with the tips of your fingers going to your forehead. Or if you are in Turkey, it's often your right hand going to your left part of your chest when they greet you. So it's different forms of greeting, even within masculinities. And this may be common amongst the culture itself, both men and women. It's not necessarily that. But they are invisible within the culture that they tend to be practiced. Okay, so what Vincent observes is that the context makes, and the description, when you start to describe it, it makes the social construction visible. When readers look at Nora Vincent's work, they recognize the relations of power between men and women and amongst men. She doesn't present any theory in her work, so that's it's a comment by the author of your textbook. But she talks about the dynamics of gender relations. She looks at masculinity and different masculine practices. And she comments as a critical gender theorist, and she looks at men who are individual agents. So that's the important thing about her work. So her work is very important in recognizing people as individual agents who practice, perform, and produce gender. So she came out with a really good book. If you're interested, go ahead and read the book. Not necessary, but it definitely is a good read. It's on my reading list, so I will not lie and say that I've read the book. It is there on my list, and when I have a chance, I'm going to go through it. It definitely sounds very interesting. The challenge with a lot of studies of men is it is common to name men. It is, well, I wouldn't say it's a challenge. The good thing about studies of men is it names men as quote unquote men and no longer as males. As you can probably tell, males is a biological definition. It's how you're born, and men is socially constructed by the individual and by the society. And that's a good thing, because when you talk about men as quote unquote men, it recognizes that they're no longer genderless, and they're not just beings of a sex category. Researchers also recognize now that masculinity is, as we said, framed by culture, and it's not a cluster of traits as was once thought. One of the challenges, feminism was wonderful in what it did, how it deconstructed the inequalities between genders as a whole. But a criticism of traditional feminism is it identified men or manhood as a cluster of traits. And the later feminism makes distinction, but early feminism definitely did that. So there's a little bit of criticism of that. But the point is, researchers obviously recognize now that it's very individualized. It's not a bunch of traits. Well, if you're tough, if you can take 2 punches in the stomach, if you can go do 50 push-ups, well, then you're a man. No, it doesn't work that way. So Research is also starting to critically look at the nuances of varied masculinity. So there are several masculinities that coexist at a given time and space, right? So critical aging and critical men studies are looking to basically break up the idea that there's a homogenized quote unquote manhood or an ideal set of gender attributes. Well, you have to be muscular, strong, hard, in control, and that's what masculinity is. That's seen more as bogus now. There's much more attention in recent studies to what the author refers to, what I call intersectionality. The author has a different term, I don't remember what it is. And intersectionality is the idea that there are several social factors that determine how men practice their masculinity. It's also important to understand that even though there are several social determinants, such as race, age, class, and sexuality, excuse me, there's a hierarchy within each of them as well. So when you think about race, a man may occupy a certain position. When you think about age, a man might occupy a certain position. When you think of class, you might have a location there. And when you think about sexuality, well, he might be somewhere within the continuum. He may be heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, maybe there's a transgender with continuum somewhere in the sexuality continuum, and so on. So it's very, very complex. So there's a hierarchy in all of these things, and sociology recognizes that even though it's not stated, people occupy positions due to their practices. And when there's a lot of these different determinants, it makes for the masculinity being located somewhere within the hierarchy of masculinities. But what's important to understand is when you think about this in a very broad term, you can start to see the recognition that there are some masculinities, some practices of masculinities, and some experiences of masculinities by some men, which gives them a considerable amount of power. And there are some practices of masculinities for some men, which put them in a stage of great disempowerment. So even though studies have generally increased in masculinities, overall, there isn't too much. Some of the more recent studies, the context can often, it demonstrates that context can often mask or silence some identities, at least in the way some identities are present and performed. For example, if someone identifies as a Japanese Canadian middle-aged man whose home is in Ottawa, but they live in Dubai, this information does not reveal additional details such as class or sexuality. So the identity is essentially masked. And when thinking about masculinities, oftentimes, when we talk about the Japanese Canadian man, we assume typically when we read that there's a Japanese Canadian man who has a home in Ottawa, living in Dubai. A lot of you have taken some sociology, and gerontology or sexuality studies and so on. So you may not assume, but a lot of people will assume that he's probably middle class. He's probably a married heterosexual father because he's an older man or middle-aged man. And these are unspoken, but still assumed. So this kind of a situation is a masked situation. This masking is consistent, but it's not fully integrated with the postmodernist turn in studies of men, which kind of clearly talks about how compulsory heterosexuality underlies and shapes gender relations and the discourse about it. So it's almost as though heterosexuality is a central axis of identity, and then that's taken for granted, but non-heterosexual identity or non-heterosexual masculinities are never taken for granted. We continue to have gaps in knowledge as how bodily aging or corporeal agents, how does that affect masculinity? In sociology and psychology and even critical gender studies, gender is often examined in relation to class, ethnicity, sexuality, nationality, and the historical time context. So that's a good thing. Most studies will focus on 2 or 3 different axes. So you'll have studies looking at masculinities and class or masculinities and sexualities. But despite all of these studies don't look at age. So, you know, they're called ageless endeavors. They ignore 20% of men. Older men are 20% of all men's populations. They're completely ignored. When studying men, there is an understanding that quote unquote social clocks and life course stages are age related and they shape masculinity performances. So even though we understand that, you know, masculinity performance are affected by, you know, when we talk about social clocks, what we mean by is the age to finish high school, the age to finish university, the age to get a job, the age to retire, and so on. So they shape masculinity performances. So we recognize that and we understand that. But life course theory, which recognizes that advantages, disadvantages in various contexts, whether it's health and nutrition, whether social connections, all of these different things, they're cumulative and they often influence each other. That understanding is there. Even with all of that understanding, masculinities continue to be thought of as age-proof. There is a singular masculinity script, whether you're a boy, whether you're a middle-aged man or an old man, there's a script. This is what it means to be a man, which is very weird because everybody seems to get the phrase act your age. Okay, so most of you have heard act your age, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, and implicit in that little phrase is the idea that your actions or how you act is going to change with your age. Okay, so behavior and practices are, even though it's implied that it's expected to change with age, all these massive studies about men, interestingly, do not account for the age-based change in masculinities. So this is from another researcher, Gabriela Spector-Mersel, in 2006 as well, just like Nora Vincent. What she contended that existing theories of masculinities, the challenge is that they ignore age, and they're an incomplete masculinity script. So all men, in some way, shape, or form, either communicate that they're practicing their masculinity close to what the script is supposed to be, and that allows what they do in reality might be quite different, but their practices, at least that's how it's communicated. But anyway, so Gabriela Spector-Mersel found that in relation to early and middle adulthood, where we find clear models of dignified masculinity, these models become vague and even non-existent when referring to later life. So her insightful thesis is very simple. Western masculinity scripts conclude somewhere before old age. She too has argued, to all intents and purposes, growing old seems to be outside conceptualization of masculinity. In most discourses, one can be masculine and one can be old, but not both. And that's a really strong statement. So it again speaks to the idea that once you start getting old, you almost become degendered and no longer masculine. So it is clear an LCP is life course perspective. So it's nothing fancy, it's just probably nobody else in your gerontology course will refer to life course perspective as LCP. I'm just lazy, but let's call it an LCP for now. Anyway, so it isn't clear whether there isn't a lifespan or a life course perspective in masculinity scholarship. It's not, I mean, I couldn't see anything. By default, men's studies, they continue to emphasize never aging masculinities. Even in social gerontology, where it's recognized that aging adults were gradually moving across a life course, so it's recognized that people are changing in their practices. It doesn't actually focus the idea on changing gender relations, changing practices, changing preferences. So there's a little bit of criticism of that. Growing old and masculinities seem to be seen as separate from being male. So one can be either masculine or old and not both. Hi. When aging and gender studies were jointly explored, the social inequalities between old men and old women were the focus. Okay, and they looked at older men and women. So how were his cumulative disadvantages affecting his mortality or late life morbidity? What happened to the men? Why do men on average die years earlier than women? Researchers highlighted the invisible social disadvantages of old men accrued as a group. Now, without doubt, the majority of old men in affluent, developed societies benefit from many forms of patriarchal privilege. We'll talk about patriarchal privilege in a second. Take, for example, you look at heteronormative. Heteronormative is rules and norms that fit a heterosexual individual. How a heteronormative patriarch system assure the man a spouse and other female relatives to provide him care for his needs. And then that's why there's the cliche that the home is the everyday man's castle. Now, the patriarchal dividend. Have any of you heard the term before? Oops, sorry. Let's patriarchal dividend. Anybody? I guess. Okay, we'll talk about that concept. I'm sure you have enough experience understanding your own personal experiences that men and women are not treated equally in society. That fair? Okay. Now, because the benefit that males gain out of simply by being male and have obtained this benefit for a long time, whether it's in industry where there's an old boys club, so you have to be male to get into a lot of these meetings, groups, and so on. These exclusive groups and the benefits that men enjoy by virtue of being men, that benefit that they have in society is called a patriarchal dividend. Okay, so that patriarchal dividend, men have to do absolutely nothing for it. You just have to be born with the right body parts and you benefit from patriarchal dividend. Okay, that's the idea of the patriarchal dividend. Now, patriarchal dividend itself, it's been studied for a long time. All feminist researchers recognize that it exists. Obviously, the issue with the patriarchal dividend is that I'm not so sure why dots are showing up. Anyway, but patriarchal dividend is not the same amongst all men. Part of the issue is patriarchal dividend assumes that there's a huge benefit reaped by being born male. It doesn't account for class, ethnic background, race, sexuality, and so on. Anyway, okay. Old men in the fringes of manhood. Now, whether it was how the theorizing of masculinities in old men studies, even though we're looking at masculinities in old men studies, it ignored old men's individual masculinities. And there's nearly exclusive attention paid to boys or midlife masculinities. And social gerontology often, through gender weighing, from old men. Within these two fields, what happened is the way old men were located in research and studies were to the fringe of manhood as storytelling grandfathers or aging veterans. I think we are quite comfortable, I'm quite comfortable in saying that not every old man is a storytelling grandfather or an aging veteran. As outsiders, metaphorically and literally, old men's lived experiences are not visible. The other issue that studies look at is the othering of old men. The concept of othering is the idea that some group of people or some individual is presented as the other. There are many forms of othering that we often see. The hockey commentator, Don Cherry, who lost his job because he said, those people who come to our country, he essentially what he did was he othered immigrants or people coming from different countries. So that's a form of othering. You also other people when you make them a group and different from yourself. When you talk, when you stereotype people. Stereotyping is unfortunately an effective way for the othering. So there are several theories on othering older men, and how you other old men is by putting them in a group, calling them seniors, because both older adults and seniors are as effective as they are in communicating the general morphology of the individual. Neither word is gendered. So it's perpetuated a type of thinking that old men cannot exemplify the lionized forms of masculinities, because the assumption is that if you're a man, you know, you have agency, you have independence, you have competence, you have responsibility. You may have once been a man because you all had all of these things when you're younger, but now that you're old, you no longer have all of these qualities. So what you're practicing does not fit within the parameters of masculinity. Any questions so far with the terms that I'm using? Anything that's absolutely new, unfamiliar, please let me know. We can go over this. I do recognize that we have students who are non-sociologists in class as well. Don't feel shy. Anybody? Okay, I guess seeing nobody, we will move forward. We are getting towards our break time, and we are not close to being finished with this chapter. And as I said, if we don't finish, it just overruns into the next time slot. So don't worry about it. Okay. Privilege is very interesting. Privilege is the idea that you get benefits for your accident of birth. And that's the best way, that's the simplest way to explain privilege. It may not be the best way. So if you're accidentally born white, if you're accidentally born male, if you're accidentally born in the United States or in Canada, you enjoy a lot of benefits that you have not worked hard to do. Okay. If you're accidentally born black, if you're accidentally born female, if you're accidentally born with a physical or a mental disability and you're accidentally born in war-torn Sudan, your absence of privilege is extreme. Okay, and so it's benefits that you gain for what you haven't done, and that's the simplest way I think we can talk about privilege. There are great YouTube videos on privilege that explain what it is. So people who may be exposed to the word privilege and don't necessarily understand what it is or whether it applies to them, just in the YouTube search window, go ahead and put videos on privilege, and there are a whole bunch of videos, and there are some exercises that you can do to understand what privilege is, how it works, and how it gives you power. Okay, so even after gerontology researchers acknowledged that aging men can be a privileged group, as a group they are privileged, that's especially in certain societies, And they embody and they practice age distinctive masculinity. So, you know, they do their own kind of masculinity that got acknowledged later. Well, fine, they're not gender free. They are male and they do practice masculinities, but it's a little different. Privilege itself, it's different amongst old people. It might be easy to think that, well, if you're an old white man, you're extremely privileged. That's not necessarily true. There are several old white men who are very privileged, but there are several old white men who are not, because privilege also depends on whether you're able-bodied, whether you're cognitively able, whether you're heterosexual, whether you have standing in class, which means whether you're above middle class, whether you're wealthy. So let's you know, just to understand privilege and its understanding, how many of you remember the recent news report in the US on the Coopers? This was a situation, I believe, in New York, where a young lady, Miss Cooper, she's fully aware of her racial privilege. What she did is she threatened a black man, interestingly with the same last name, Mr. Cooper. She threatened him because he told her not to let her dog off leash in a bird reserve in public park. So she threatened to call the police on him because he told her not to let her dog run loose. And she said, I'm going to say that I'm feeling threatened. And she essentially was well aware that she is a white woman and she could weaponize the privilege that she held because of a race for the black man. Okay, so the point here is privilege is very interesting. You can assume that by virtue of being male, a man should have privilege over women, but that is applicable only in a limited context. If you're black in North America, if you're Aboriginal in Canada, if you're not white, you may have far less privilege than a white. You may have far less privilege than any person white, black, man, woman, doesn't matter. Okay, so privilege is an interesting concept. And the criticism in masculinity studies is that even when studying masculinities, the idea of privilege and how it works, how it trickles down is still being understood. It's very complex. We are at 10:30 a.m. We're going to have a 15-minute wellness break. All of you have been patient with me despite our moving back and forth between systems. 15-minute break. I'm going to be in and around the computer. You guys can go have a bathroom break or whatever. Leave everything logged in so we don't have to kind of get you back into class and all of those things. But if you have any questions, I'm still